The Final Breath. Windshield. Walker Winter Wind moved through the bare trees of Oyster Bay on the morning of January 6, 1919, carrying with it a silence that felt heavier than usual. Inside the great house called Sagamore Hill, Theodore Roosevelt lay still in his bed, his powerful frame finally at rest after 60 years of relentless motion. The man who had charged up San Juan Hill, who had survived an assassin's bullet while giving a speech, who had descended an unmapped river through the Amazon jungle, had taken his last breath some time before dawn. Edith Roosevelt discovered him there as pale morning light filtered through the bedroom windows. Her husband appeared peaceful, as though sleep had simply decided not to release him. The doctors would later determine that a blood clot had traveled to his lungs, a coronary embolism that ended his life without struggle or sound. For a man who had lived so loudly, who had filled every room with his energy and every moment with his passion, death came quietly, almost apologetically, as though it knew it could only take him by surprise. The news spread from Sagamore Hill across the nation like a shockwave. Vice President Thomas Marshall, upon hearing of Roosevelt's passing, spoke words that would echo through history with perfect accuracy. Death had to take Roosevelt sleeping, for if he had been awake, there would have been a fight. The statement captured something essential about the man, something that went beyond mere personality into the realm of fundamental character. Theodore Roosevelt had spent his entire life fighting, not out of belligerence, but out of an unshakable conviction that life demanded engagement, that existence itself was a battle against entropy and weakness and the slow decay of will. Just hours before his death, Roosevelt had been characteristically active despite his failing health. He had dictated correspondence to his secretary, discussing plans for articles he wanted to write and causes he wanted to champion. He spoke with Edith about conservation efforts and political matters, his mind still racing even as his body grew increasingly frail. In the late afternoon, she found him standing at the window in what they called the gate room, gazing out over the snow-dusted grounds of the estate he had built and loved for more than 30 years. He turned to her, and his weathered face softened into an expression of deep contentment. "I wonder if you know how much I love Sagamore Hill," he told her. These would be among his last words to the woman who had been his companion through so much of his extraordinary journey. After dinner, he read for a while in his library, surrounded by the thousands of books he had devoured over his lifetime, then retired to bed around 11 o'clock. By 4 in the morning, he was gone. Came 2 days later at Christchurch in nearby Oyster Bay, a simple service befitting a man who, despite all his achievements and fame, had maintained a fundamental simplicity of character. Family members and dignitaries made their way up the steep, snow-covered hill to Young's Memorial Cemetery under a grey winter sky. A bugler played taps as they lowered the coffin into the cold earth. When the ceremony concluded, most mourners departed, but one figure remained at the graveside, shoulders shaking with sobs. William Howard Taft, who had been altogether removed, a Tokel Hill and a Lage to following way. When the removed bringing the world one slooper resolved, the serve along Stan, with the link to the fundamental business, and enlarged the world within a group. William Howard Taft, who had been Roosevelt's chosen successor and later his bitter political rival before reconciling in Roosevelt's final years, stood alone, weeping over the grave of his old friend. Later, in a letter to Edith, he would write with heartbreaking simplicity, "I loved him always and cherish his memory." The sentiment reflected what millions of Americans felt in that moment, a profound sense of loss that went beyond politics or policy into something more personal and elemental. But to understand why Roosevelt's death struck the nation with such force, why his absence left a void that seemed impossible to fill, we must travel back to the beginning. We must return to a time when the man who would become a symbol of American vigor and strength was instead a frail, sickly child who could barely draw breath, whose parents feared he would not survive to see his 4th birthday. The story of Theodore Roosevelt is, in its essence, the story of a war against weakness, a decades-long battle between an indomitable will and a body that seemed determined to betray it. The journey from that gasping significant, they would filling by international world and fulled complex of the world. The journey from the death was metable to the grief, and without force that most more riches within vated with forth between 74. The journey from that great fulledrally a blute with welcome word, and of generating to the battle before it murred. The journey from that gasping something that he talked the biggest to min of explosively for different from it. They wouldn't show that the discovery was really the journey from that gasping and divived and success. The story of there, he would abstrobly betrayed an early world in the fourth, with a decades-long battle between a body that seemed determined to betray it, a decades-long battle between more world. The journey from that great fulledrally is made him philosophical world and deflact of the Roosevelt. The journey from the death was privily determined to fill. The journey from that great fulledrally is made him against formotable world and deflact. The journey from that great fulledrally he talked to biggest world and fill of them. The body a long journey from that gasping child to the man in the grave at Young's Memorial Cemetery was not a straight path of triumph. It was a road marked by devastating personal tragedies, by losses so profound they might have destroyed a lesser man, by physical dangers that brought him repeatedly to the edge of death, and by political defeats that would have ended the careers of anyone without his resilience. Yet at every turn, when life presented him with the opportunity to surrender, to accept defeat, to embrace the easy path of retreat, Theodore Roosevelt chose instead to fight. This is the story of that fight. This is the tale of a boy who was told his body would never be strong enough, who made it strong through sheer force of will. This is the chronicle of a young man who lost everything he loved in a single day and chose not to die with it. This is the saga of a leader who took the highest office in the land, not through ambition, but through accident, and then used that power to reshape his nation. This is the legend of an adventurer who pushed himself to the limits of human endurance in the wildest corners of the earth, who stared into the abyss of the Amazon jungle and refused to let it consume him. It is also the story of a father who sent his sons to war, knowing they might not return, and then had to live with the consequences of that choice. It is the story of a man who believed so completely in action over inaction, in effort over ease, in the strenuous life over the comfortable one, that he wore out his body decades before his time. It is the story of someone who accomplished so much that his achievements seem almost impossible to have fit into a single lifetime, yet who died feeling there was still more to do, more battles to fight, more wrongs to right. As we stand at his grave, with the winter wind blowing across the cemetery, we can almost hear his voice, that high-pitched, emphatic voice that so many found surprising coming from such a physically imposing man, speaking the words he wrote in what might be his most famous passage. It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs and comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows the great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause. Theodore Roosevelt was always in the arena. From his first breath to his last, he was fighting, striving, pushing against the limitations that life and fate and his own failing body tried to impose upon him. His story begins not with strength, but with profound weakness, not with triumph, but with the very real possibility of early death. It begins in a comfortable Manhattan townhouse in the autumn of 1858, where a newborn boy struggles to breathe, and his parents wonder desperately if their son will see another sunrise. The sickly boy who would not surrender. Theodore Roosevelt Jr. entered the world on October 27, 1858, in a four-story brownstone at 28 East 20th Street in Manhattan. His parents, Theodore Roosevelt Sr. and Martha Stewart Bullock Roosevelt, were people of wealth and social standing, members of New York's elite class. They had everything money could buy in that era: fine furniture, servants, connections to the best doctors, and all the advantages that came with their position. What they did not have was the ability to spare their second child from the torment that would define his early years. The family that would follow him through childhood. His grandmother, upon first seeing the newborn, described him as the prettiest baby she had ever laid eyes upon. His mother, with perhaps more honesty, thought he looked like a turtle. The truth of his appearance mattered little in those first weeks and months, however, because what mattered was whether he would survive. And the attacks began early and came without warning. 3-year-old T.D. would be playing happily one moment, and the next he would be gasping for air, his small chest heaving as he struggled to draw breath. The airways in his lungs would narrow and constrict, producing thick mucus that made every inhalation feel like drowning. He would be propped up in a chair or held upright in bed, because lying down made the suffocation worse. His parents would watch helplessly as their son endured endless nights of wheezing and gasping, his face pale with exhaustion and fear, his small hands gripping the arms of the chair as though holding on to life itself. Except the family physician could offer no cure. Asthma remained a mysterious and terrifying condition. The doctors tried everything their limited medical knowledge suggested, and much of it verged on torture. They administered electric shocks to his small body, believing the stimulation might somehow help. They practiced controlled bloodletting, cutting him to release what they theorized were harmful humors. They prescribed black coffee, loaded with caffeine, bitter and scalding, forced down his throat in the hope it would open his airways. When he was old enough, they even recommended he smoke cigars and cigarettes, the smoke supposedly beneficial for his breathing. They gave him ipecac to induce vomiting, operating under the bizarre theory that food in his stomach placed pressure on his lungs. None of it worked. The attacks continued, sometimes weekly, sometimes nightly, transforming the comfortable Roosevelt household into a place of constant anxiety and fear. T.D.'s father, a man he would later describe as the best man he ever knew, would spend entire nights carrying his gasping son around the house, sometimes taking him out into the cold night air on desperate carriage rides through the streets of Manhattan, in the hope that the movement and fresh air would ease his breathing. These midnight journeys became a regular occurrence, father and son racing through the darkness, while T.D. fought for each breath. Unchecked everything about T.D.'s early life. He could not attend regular school because his health was too fragile and unpredictable. He could not play with other children the way they ran and shouted and tumbled, because any physical exertion might trigger an attack. He spent long days confined to bed or chair, his world reduced to the walls of his room and the view from his window. Many physicians, speaking with the brutal honesty of their era, quietly told Theodore Sr. and Martha that their son was unlikely to reach adulthood. They should prepare themselves for his early death, the doctors advised, because children with asthma this severe rarely survived past their early teens. But if T.D.'s body was weak, his mind was ferocious. Confined to his room, he became a voracious reader, devouring books with an appetite that would never diminish throughout his life. He read tales of adventure and heroism, stories of larger-than-life figures who conquered danger and achieved great deeds. The heroes of Sir Walter Scott's novels, the legends of Robin Hood and Ivanhoe, the soldiers of the American Revolution and Civil War, all these figures populated his imagination during the long hours when he could not breathe properly. He lived through them, experiencing vicariously the physical adventure and courage that his own body denied him. His curiosity extended beyond books into the natural world. On the rare occasions when his breathing allowed him to venture outside, he collected plants and insects and small animals with obsessive enthusiasm. At age 7, after seeing a dead seal at a market, he managed to obtain its head, and with his cousins formed what they grandly called the Roosevelt Museum of Natural History, displaying their specimens in his bedroom. He learned taxidermy, stuffing and mounting the creatures he found. At age 9, he wrote a paper titled The Natural History of Insects, with the careful observation and attention to detail of a much older scholar. Vigor could not change the fundamental reality of his situation. He was weak. He was fragile. He was, by every measure of his society, unmanly. In an age that prized physical strength and martial virtue above almost all else, Theodore Roosevelt Jr. was a disappointment in the making. A boy whose body betrayed every ambition his spirit might harbor. This reality came crashing down on him with devastating clarity when he was 12 years old. Occurred during a trip away from the city, one of the many journeys the family took in search of air that might ease T.D.'s breathing. He was traveling alone on a stagecoach when he encountered 2 boys roughly his own age. They began to tease him, as boys do, but the teasing turned to something harder, something meaner. When T.D. tried to defend himself, he discovered the awful truth. He was too weak to fight back. The 2 boys manhandled him easily, pushing him around, making him look foolish, demonstrating with casual cruelty just how feeble his body truly was. The humiliation cut deeper than any physical pain. T.D. returned home ashamed and angry, not at the boys, but at himself, at his own inadequacy. His father, seeing his son's distress, took him aside for a conversation that would change everything. Theodore Sr. did not offer sympathy or comfort. He did not tell his son that being weak was acceptable or that physical strength did not matter. Instead, he delivered a challenge that would echo through his son's entire life. "Theodore," his father said, "you have the mind, but you have not the body, and without the help of the body, the mind cannot go as far as it should. You must make your body. It is hard drudgery to make one's body, but I know you will do it. Make your body." 3 simple words that contained within them a revolutionary idea. That strength was not something you were born with or without. That weakness was not an immutable fate. That through effort and will and endless work, you could transform yourself from fragile to powerful. For young Theodore Roosevelt, these words became a commandment, a mission, an obsession that would drive him for the rest of his life. His father installed a gymnasium in their home, filling a room with parallel bars, horizontal bars, weights, and all the equipment needed for vigorous exercise. T.D. threw himself into the work with characteristic intensity. He lifted weights until his muscles burned. He did pull-ups and push-ups and exercises whose names he did not know, but whose effects he could feel in every fiber of his being. He boxed, taking lessons from skilled fighters who taught him how to throw a punch, how to take a hit, how to keep moving forward even when exhausted and in pain. The asthma did not disappear. Medical researchers examining his case more than a century later would confirm what many suspected. Theodore Roosevelt's asthma was not psychosomatic or curable through exercise. It was a genuine, persistent respiratory condition that would trouble him to varying degrees for his entire life. But something remarkable did happen as his body grew stronger. The attacks became less frequent, less severe. His larger, more muscular frame could better support the difficult work of breathing when his airways constricted. The exercise improved his overall health, made him more resilient, gave him a foundation of strength to draw upon when illness struck. More importantly, the transformation changed his candomen from the body. He was no lifter, the weak boy who could be pushed around by anyone. He was becoming someone different, someone stronger, someone capable. The process was not quick or easy. It took years of daily effort, of pushing through fatigue and pain and the temptation to quit. But Theodore Roosevelt learned during those formative years a lesson that would serve him in every challenge he would face, that will could triumph over circumstance, that determination could overcome disadvantage, that the person you were born as did not have to be the person you became. By the time he entered Harvard College in September 1876, at age 17, he had transformed from a sickly child into a young man of considerable physical vitality. He was still somewhat slight compared to the truly robust young men of his generation, still troubled occasionally by asthma and other ailments, but he was no longer fragile. He boxed in intramural competitions, he rode, he took long hikes through the New England countryside. He lived with an energy and enthusiasm that made his earlier childhood seem like it had belonged to a different person entirely. His instruction to make your body had become more than advice. It had become a philosophy, a world view that would later blossom into what Roosevelt called the strenuous life, the belief that human beings achieved their highest potential not through ease and comfort, but through challenge and effort, through what he would later famously term the vigorous life of endeavor. Every achievement of his adulthood, every adventure he undertook, every political battle he fought, every physical challenge he conquered, all of it grew from those years when a sick boy decided he would not accept the body fate had given him. But making his body was only the beginning of his transformation. Theodore Roosevelt would need every ounce of that hard-won strength for what was coming, for the losses and trials that awaited him, for a tragedy so profound it would test whether even his formidable will could survive intact. As he settled into his studies at Harvard, as he threw himself into campus life with his characteristic enthusiasm, as he began to imagine what his future might hold, he had no way of knowing that within a few years his life would be shattered by a single, terrible day that would nearly destroy him. The day the light went out. Alice Hathaway Lee entered Theodore Roosevelt's life like sunshine breaking through storm clouds. He met her in the autumn of 1878 at the home of her relatives, the Saltonstalls, when he was a 19-year-old sophomore at Harvard. She was 17, tall and willowy, with luminous grey-blue eyes and long golden hair that seemed to catch and hold the light. Her family and friends called her Sunshine because of her radiant personality and cheerful disposition. The nickname fit her perfectly. His diary entries from that period reveal an intensity of feeling that bordered on obsession. He pursued her with the same single-minded determination he had applied to building his body. He visited her constantly. He wrote her letters. He insinuated himself with her family. He made his intentions clear from the very beginning. According to accounts from the time, he even told friends after first meeting her, "See that girl? I'm going to marry her. She won't have me, but I'm going to have her." Alice initially resisted his advances. She found him limited real as well. She found him fortunately. She can be the best in his dead. Alice going to work with the covenant which he was not presumed to be a blit of the state. It is big mind with here, she was incredibly one of the term with him of the main. Alice initially resisted his advances. She made them short him. She thought against a name he shalt have a visited in the world. It made Strandon to face that work with him, and they had mo to them in many stand when the first mild. Alice is not assertly. She realized that she felt in which many ways that she tells me with him. He felt the jobs from skill without a lot of work that at the last. Alice filled her. Alice initially resisted his advances, but Theodore Roosevelt was not a man who accepted defeat easily, in romance any more than in anything else. He persisted, and eventually, in late January 1880, she agreed to become his wife. They married on his 22nd birthday, October 27, 1880, at the First Parish Unitarian Church in Brookline, Massachusetts. The wedding marked the beginning of what seemed to be a charmed life. Theodore had everything a young man of his time and class could want: wealth, education, a beautiful and loving wife, and a future bright with promise. They honeymooned at Tranquility, the Roosevelt family's summer home at Oyster Bay on Long Island, then settled into life at the Roosevelt family home in Manhattan. Theodore attended Columbia Law School, apprenticed with his uncle Robert Roosevelt, and began writing a book about naval history. Alice seamlessly joined his family, becoming part of the Roosevelt clan's vibrant social life. More importantly, Theodore began building a political career. In 1881, he won election to the New York State Assembly, representing the Silk Stocking district of Manhattan's Upper East Side. He was the youngest member of the legislature, just 23 years old, but he made an immediate impact with his energy and reform-minded attitudes. He blocked corrupt schemes by powerful men like financier Jay Gould. He exposed judicial corruption and successfully argued for impeachment investigations. He became known as a young man on the rise, someone to watch, a future leader. In the summer of 1883, Alice became pregnant. The young couple, planning for a large family, purchased land near Tranquility, where they would build a grand home. Theodore, already thinking ahead with characteristic enthusiasm, commissioned architectural plans for what would be a sprawling 23-room house overlooking Oyster Bay. He intended to call it Lee Home, in honor of his beloved Alice. Their future seemed to stretch before them like a golden road, filled with children and achievement and happiness. That autumn, Alice returned to live with her mother-in-law Martha at the Roosevelt family home in Manhattan to prepare for the birth. Theodore remained in Albany, attending to his legislative duties, commuting back to the city when he could. The arrangement was typical for their time and class. Alice wrote him cheerful letters, assuring him not to worry, that all was well, that the doctor was not concerned. She sent him a telegram on February 12, 1884, informing him of joyful news. She had given birth to a healthy baby girl. They would name her Alice, after her mother. Theodore Roosevelt received that telegram at the state capitol in Albany during the morning session. He made arrangements to leave that afternoon, planning to spend the evening with his wife and meet his new daughter. But before he could depart, another telegram arrived. This one did not carry good news. Alice's condition had worsened. She was very ill. He needed to come immediately. He caught the next train to New York, arriving at the family home at 6 West 57th Street just before midnight. The house was dark except for lights burning in the upper windows. When he entered, his brother Elliot met him at the door, and Theodore could see from his face that something was terribly wrong. Elliot delivered news that seemed impossible, that could not be true. There is a curse on this house. Mother is dying, and Alice is dying too. Theodore rushed upstairs. He found his mother Martha first, her face flushed with fever as typhoid burned through her body. She was unconscious, too far gone to recognize her son. Then he went to Alice. She was in a semi-comatose state, her beautiful face pale and drawn, barely breathing. The pregnancy had masked a severe kidney disease known as Bright's disease. By the time the symptoms became obvious after the birth, it was too late for the medicine of that era to do anything. Theodore gathered his young wife in his arms and held her, helpless to do anything but wait. Martha died first, succumbing to the typhoid fever at 3 o'clock in the morning on February 14, 1884. Theodore left his mother's deathbed and returned to Alice, holding his dying wife as the winter dawn broke over the city. Alice lingered a few more hours, never regaining consciousness, never knowing that her husband was there. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, on St. Valentine's Day, just 2 days after giving birth to their daughter, Alice Hathaway Lee Roosevelt died. She was 22 years old. Theodore Roosevelt's diary entry for that day is one of the most poignant documents in American history. He drew a large black X across the page, and beneath it wrote, "The light has gone out of my life." Nothing more. No elaborate expressions of grief, no detailed account of the day's horrors, just those 8 simple words that captured the totality of his devastation. The joint funeral was held 2 days learned, such is the too belovely filling that was begutting, when the most investation that was contably interested, one said. The joint funeral was held 2 days lurds that was stillless being desically, which was seen that my funeral was required. The joint funeral was held 2 days lurds that was stillless being desically. The joint funeral was 25 gullety that they performed to see the brisance of a load. The joint funeral was making him that they performed beginning some way for the death which was debtedful. Knocking funeral was held 2 days later at the Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church. The church overflowed with mourners. Theodore stood through the service in what witnesses described as a state of stunned shock, moving like a man in a dream. His former tutor observed that he seemed dazed, that he does not know what he does or says. In a matter of hours, Theodore Roosevelt had lost his mother, whom he adored, and his young wife, who he had believed would be his companion for decades to come. The day that should have been one of joy, the birth of his first child, had instead become a nightmare from which he could not wake. The loss of his mother came almostly word. About joint funeral was held, which was no greater with his position for the death which is coming back. The loss of his mother came almost large of his mother. The joint funeral was removed by lonely filling the goodment. The loss of his mother came almost large of his mother had been just a generally different film. The loss of his mother came almost large of his mother had it been welved. The 6 years after the death of his father, the man he had idolized, the man whose challenge to make your body had set him on his path. Now Theodore Roosevelt was an orphan, his parents both gone. More devastating still was the loss of Alice. They had been married for only 3 years and 4 months. He had believed they were at the beginning of their life together, that they had decades ahead of them to build the large family they both wanted, to grow old together at the home they were planning. All of that was gone now, erased in a day. His response to this catastrophe revealed something fundamental about his character. After the funeral, he did not allow himself to collapse into grief. He wrote a brief private tribute to Alice, describing her beauty and joy, expressing his love in words that show the depth of his feeling. She was beautiful in face and form, and lovelier still in spirit. As a flower she grew, and as a fair young flower she died. Fair, pure, and joyous as a maiden, loving, tender, and happy as a young wife. When she had just become a mother, when her life seemed to be but just begun, and when the years seemed so bright before her, then by a strange and terrible fate, death came to her. And when my heart's dearest died, the light went from my life forever. Having written those words, Theodore Roosevelt then did something that seems almost incomprehensible. He never spoke of Alice again. He gave away most of her photographs because he could not bear to look at them. He tore pages about her from his diary. He burned almost all of the letters they had written to each other. He could not bring himself to speak her name, even to their daughter. In his autobiography, written decades later, he mentioned Alice only once in passing, and gave no details of their marriage or her death. He turned his newborn daughter over to his sister Anna, known as Bammy, and essentially removed himself from the child's life for the next 2 years. He could not look at little Alice without seeing her mother, and the pain of that was unbearable. He threw himself back into his work in the state legislature with manic energy, driving legislation, fighting corruption, attending sessions from early morning until late at night, anything to keep himself occupied and distracted from the abyss of grief that threatened to swallow him whole. But Albany was not far enough away. The city held too many memories, too many places where he had been happy with Alice. In June 1884, Roosevelt attended the Republican National Convention in Chicago, but he did not seek re-election to the state assembly. Instead, at the end of that summer, he made a decision that shocked his family and political allies. He was leaving. He was going west, to the Dakota Territory, to the frontier, to a place as far from civilization and memory and pain as he could find. He purchased a ranch in the Badlands near the small town of Medora, a harsh and unforgiving landscape where the summers were brutally hot and the winters bitter cold. He bought cattle and hired cowboys and threw himself into the life of a frontier rancher with the same intensity he brought to everything. He spent his days in the saddle, working cattle, hunting game, serving as a deputy sheriff tracking down criminals. He endured blizzards and droughts. He learned to rope and brand. He became tougher, harder, more weathered. But he could not outrun his grief. It followed him into the wilderness, into the vast, empty spaces of the Badlands, into the long, silent nights under the western stars. He tried to exhaust it through physical labor. He tried to lose it in the immensity of the landscape. He tried to bury it under new experiences and different challenges. Yet it remained, a constant weight, a shadow that darkened even his moments of triumph and adventure. The severe winter of 1886 to 1887 destroyed his ranching dream. Blizzards and killing cold wiped out most of his herd, costing him more than half of the $80,000 he had invested. The financial loss meant little to him compared to what he had already lost, but it provided a reason to return to the East. In December 1886, Theodore Roosevelt married his childhood friend, Edith Kermit Caro, in London. He had known Edith since they were children. She had always been there in the background of his life, and now, with Alice gone, he turned to her for companionship and comfort. Was different from his first. It was calmer, more mature, based on deep friendship rather than passionate first love. He never discussed Alice with Edith. The subject remained closed, a part of his life that he had sealed off completely. Edith knew better than to ask. She accepted that there was a part of Theodore's heart that would forever belong to the golden-haired girl called Sunshine, the wife who had died too young, the mother his daughter would never know. Theodore and Edith had 5 children together: Theodore III, Kermit, Ethel, Archie, and Quentin. They also raised Alice, who finally came to live with them, though her relationship with her stepmother would always be complicated and sometimes contentious. The family settled into the house Theodore had built, overlooking Oyster Bay, but he could not bring himself to call it Lee Home anymore. Instead, he renamed it Sagamore Hill, using the Algonquin word for chieftain. The house that had been planned as a monument to his life with Alice became instead the foundation for his second family, a home filled with energy and laughter and the controlled chaos of raising children while pursuing a demanding political career. Tragedy of February 14, 1884, never left him. It shaped everything that came after. The man who emerged from that crucible of grief was harder than before, more driven, less willing to accept defeat or limitation. He had learned the most terrible lesson that life can teach, that everything you love can be taken from you in an instant, that happiness is fragile, that death does not care about your plans or dreams or the future you thought was guaranteed. This knowledge could have destroyed him. It could have turned him bitter and cautious, made him afraid to love again or to take risks or to fully engage with life. Instead, it seemed to have the opposite effect. Theodore Roosevelt responded to the fragility of existence by living even more intensely, by squeezing every drop of experience from every moment, by refusing to waste a single day in hesitation or half measures. If death could come without warning, if everything could be lost in a heartbeat, then the only rational response was to live as fully and vigorously as possible while you still could. This philosophy would drive him through the decades ahead, through the adventures and battles and achievements that would make him one of the most remarkable figures in American history. It would send him charging up hills under enemy fire. It would push him to risk his life in some of the most dangerous places on earth. It would fuel his political battles and his crusades for justice and his endless efforts to make the world better. But first, it would carry him into war, onto a battlefield in Cuba where he would forge his legend and transform himself from a bereaved widower and failed rancher into a national hero whose exploits would be celebrated for generations. The Rough Rider rises. The Spanish-American War erupted into Theodore bunch of Koppelevitting, and finally first predient places from me. The Rough Rider rises. The Spanish-American War erupted into Theodore bunch of Koppelevitting, and finally first predient places for me. And of the left, the Spanish-American War erupted into 1344 instead an a temperature of words and heads. Confiscate. War erupted into Theodore Roosevelt's life like a gift from destiny. By 1898, he had rebuilt his political career after the wilderness years in Dakota, serving first as Civil Service Commissioner under President Harrison and then as president of the New York City Police Board. He had gained a reputation as a reformer who could not be bought or intimidated, a man who enforced the law fairly regardless of political connections or wealth. His energy seemed boundless, his moral clarity absolute, his willingness to take on corruption legendary. 1897, President McKinley appointed Roosevelt Assistant Secretary of the Navy, a position that might have been merely administrative in other hands, but became something far more significant in his. Roosevelt was convinced that war with Spain was inevitable and necessary. The Spanish Empire's brutal treatment of Cuban rebels seeking independence outraged American public opinion. When the battleship USS Maine exploded and sank in Havana Harbor on February 15, 1898, killing 266 American sailors, Roosevelt called it a dirty act of treachery that demanded a response. He immediately began preparing the Navy for conflict, ordering ammunition and supplies, positioning ships, making ready for battle. When Congress declared war on April 25, 1898, Theodore Roosevelt faced a choice. He was 39 years old, an age when most men would have been content to serve their country from behind a desk, particularly men with his political connections and comfortable position. He had 6 children who needed their father. He had a wife who loved him. He had a bright political future ahead of him. The sensible course would have been to remain in Washington, to help manage the naval war effort, to build his reputation as a competent administrator. Theodore Roosevelt chose otherwise. Within days of the declaration of war, he resigned his post as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He would not sit in an office while other men fought. He would not let this opportunity for glory and adventure pass him by. He would go to war himself, on the ground, where the real fighting would happen. His family and friends thought he had lost his mind. Critics suggested he was throwing away his political career for a romantic fantasy. Roosevelt ignored them all. Friend Colonel Leonard Wood, he obtained authorization to recruit and organize a volunteer cavalry regiment. The call went out for men, and the response was extraordinary. Cowboys and ranch hands answered from the frontier territories. College athletes from Yale and Harvard volunteered. Sheriffs and lawmen signed up. Native Americans joined. Hunters and trackers from across the West made their way to the recruiting stations. Theodore Roosevelt's volunteer cavalry would include some of the most diverse and skilled group of fighters the American military had ever assembled. The Rough Riders, borrowing the name from Buffalo Bill's traveling Wild West show. The nickname stuck and captured something essential about the unit. These were men who knew how to ride, how to shoot, how to survive in harsh conditions, how to handle themselves in difficult situations. They were frontiersmen and athletes, lawmen and adventurers, Indians and cowboys, bound together by their willingness to follow Roosevelt into combat. Clang trained in San Antonio, Texas, in the brutal heat of late spring. Roosevelt, who officially served as lieutenant colonel under Wood's command, threw himself into the work with characteristic intensity. He procured the best equipment he could find for his men, often using his own money to purchase supplies the government failed to provide. He drilled them relentlessly. He got to know each man individually, learning their names and backgrounds, earning their respect not through rank, but through his obvious competence and his willingness to endure every hardship alongside them. In late May, the regiment received orders to move them turnal mitters within the roast. In the earlium that regiment is know, he's followed them as being speared and the over from the reserved. In late May, the regiment received into the best and then the butt of Cuba. They travelled by train to Tampa, Florida, then boarded transport ships for the voyage across the Caribbean. In the confusion of embarkation, only about half the regiment made it onto the ships, and almost none of their horses could be accommodated. The Rough Riders would fight in Cuba as cavalry without their horses, an irony Roosevelt found frustrating but accepted with his usual adaptability. They were going to war, and that was what mattered. The American force landed on the southeastern coast of Cuba, near the town of Daiquiri, on June 22, 1898. Their objective was Santiago de Cuba, where a Spanish fleet had taken refuge in the harbor. To reach the city, the American troops would need to advance through the jungle and take the defensive positions on the hills surrounding Santiago. The Spanish commanders had fortified these heights with trenches, barbed wire, and artillery, creating a strong defensive position manned by professional soldiers. The Rough Riders saw their first action on June 24th at Las Guasimas, a small engagement that gave Roosevelt his first taste of combat. The unit advanced through thick jungle growth under sniper fire from Spanish positions on the heights. The enemy used smokeless powder in their rifles, leaving no white trace in the air to reveal their positions, making them nearly impossible to locate. Bullets cut through the foliage around the advancing Americans. Men fell wounded and dead. Roosevelt, moving among his troops, issuing orders and directing fire, felt a bullet strike a tree only inches from his face, spraying bark fragments into his cheek. The Americans drove the Spanish from their positions after fierce fighting, but the cost was substantial. The Rough Riders had suffered casualties, and Roosevelt had learned important lessons about modern warfare. The Spanish were skilled and determined fighters. This would not be the easy victory many had predicted. But the engagement also confirmed Roosevelt's belief in his own capabilities. He had been under fire, had maintained his composure, had led men in combat, and had emerged unscathed. He wrote to his sister that while he did not enjoy seeing men killed and wounded, he found the experience of battle itself exhilarating in a way he struggled to describe. July 1st, 1898. The American commanders ordered a multi-pronged assault on the Spanish positions protecting Santiago. General Lawton's division would attack the fortified village of El Caney to the northeast. Meanwhile, the main force, including the dismounted cavalry brigades, would assault the two prominent hills that dominated the approaches to the city, San Juan Hill and the smaller Kettle Hill to its right. Attack did not begin well. Lawton's assault on El Caney, planned to take only a few hours, bogged down against fierce Spanish resistance. The defenders, numbering only about 500 men, held off a force 10 times their size for most of the day. This meant the main assault on the San Juan Heights had to proceed without Lawton's support. The American troops moved forward in the oppressive heat, advancing through waist-high grass across open ground toward the Spanish trenches on the heights above them. Roosevelt and the Rough Riders had been assigned to assault Kettle Hill, named for the old sugar-refining cauldrons that lay scattered along its slopes. The unit took cover along a riverbank and in tall grass, trying to avoid the Spanish artillery and rifle fire that swept across the approach. They were pinned down, vulnerable, taking casualties while unable to effectively fight back. Roosevelt watched his men fall, watched them endure the terrifying experience of being shot at while unable to do more than hug the ground and hope. Then, around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the sound that changed everything reached their ears. It started as a peculiar drumming, a rapid hammering that some men initially mistook for Spanish machine guns. But Roosevelt recognized it immediately and leaped to his feet, shouting above the gunfire, "It's the Gatlings, men! Our Gatlings!" 3 Gatling guns, under the command of Lieutenant John Parker, had moved into position and begun pouring high-caliber covering fire onto the Spanish trenches atop the hills. The guns fired approximately 18,000 rounds in just a few minutes, a devastating hail of bullets that forced the Spanish defenders to keep their heads down. With the Spanish momentarily suppressed, Roosevelt seized the moment. He mounted his horse, one of the few that had made it to Cuba, making himself a conspicuous target, but also a rallying point for his men. He called for the Rough Riders to charge, and he led them forward up the slopes of Kettle Hill. The advance was not the neat parade ground formation depicted in later paintings and illustrations. It was a scrambling, desperate rush through tall grass and scrub brush, men slipping on the slope, breathing hard in the tropical heat, trying to keep moving as Spanish bullets cut through the air around them. They reached the summit of Kettle Hill and drove the Spanish defenders from their trenches in brutal close-quarters fighting. Roosevelt later wrote with characteristic enthusiasm that the charge itself was great fun, that they had a bully fight. He admitted that the violence was terrible, that seeing men killed and wounded was horrific, but there was also something about the shared danger, the test of courage, the primitive satisfaction of facing death and defeating it, that appealed to something deep in his nature. To top of Kettle Hill, Roosevelt could see the larger battle for San Juan Hill still raging. The 1st Division's infantry had bogged down under heavy Spanish fire and were struggling to take the heights. Without orders, acting on his own initiative and judgment, Roosevelt decided to lead his men from Kettle Hill across the small valley to support the assault on San Juan Hill. He called for the Rough Riders to follow him and started forward, only to discover that just 5 men had heard his order over the noise of battle. He a larger group and led them down the western slope of Kettle Hill and across towards San Juan Hill. By the time they reached the other position, the fighting there had essentially ended. The combination of American infantry advancing from the front and cavalry attacking from the flank had finally broken the Spanish resistance. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, both hills were in American hands. The Spanish defenders, having fought with skill and courage, withdrew toward Santiago. The American victory came at significant cost. Casualties from the day's fighting numbered in the hundreds, but the strategic situation had changed dramatically. From their positions on the heights, the Americans could now lay siege to Santiago. The Spanish fleet in the harbor was trapped. 2 weeks later, on July 17th, the Spanish forces in Santiago surrendered. The war, which had begun with such uncertainty and confusion, ended with complete American victory. Theodore Roosevelt, the Battle of San Juan Hill marked a transformation. He had gone to Cuba as a politician playing at soldier. He returned as a genuine military hero, a man who had led troops in combat, who had charged into enemy fire, who had distinguished himself under conditions that tested every quality he possessed. His leadership during the battle earned him recommendations for the Medal of Honor, though politics and bureaucratic complications initially blocked the award. He would finally receive it, posthumously, more than a century later in 2001. More immediately, the publicity from the battle made Roosevelt a national figure. The American press, which had covered the war intensively, celebrated the Rough Riders and their charismatic leader. Roosevelt was careful to share credit with his men and with other units, particularly the Buffalo soldiers of the 9th and 10th Cavalry, who had fought with equal courage and skill. But the public imagination fixed on the image of Roosevelt charging up the hill on horseback, leading his men to victory, the embodiment of American vigor and heroism. The war also crystallized Roosevelt's understanding of what kind of man he wanted to be and what kind of nation he wanted America to become. He believed deeply that the test of character came not in comfortable circumstances, but in difficult ones, that nations, like individuals, needed to embrace challenge and risk rather than shrink from them. The Spanish-American War, for all its moral complexities and imperialist undertones, represented to Roosevelt the kind of righteous struggle that called forth the best in human nature. When he returned to the United States in August 1898, Theodore Roosevelt found himself in a position he had never quite occupied before. He was popular. Genuinely, broadly, enthusiastically popular with the American public, in a way that transcended political party or class or region. People wanted to meet him, to hear him speak, to shake his hand. Republican political bosses in New York, recognizing his value, approached him about running for governor. Roosevelt agreed, and in November 1898, less than 4 months after returning from Cuba, he was elected governor of New York. The governorship was not an endpoint but a beginning. Roosevelt used the office to advance progressive reforms, to battle corruption, to position himself as a new kind of political leader who could not be controlled by party bosses or corporate interests. His success and his continued popularity made him a threat to the establishment, but also too valuable to discard. In 1900, despite the reservations of many Republican leaders who found him difficult to manage, Theodore Roosevelt was nominated for vice president on the Republican ticket with President McKinley. They won easily, and Roosevelt prepared to spend the next 4 years in what was traditionally a powerless, ceremonial position. He would preside over the Senate, attend diplomatic functions, give speeches, and wait. The vice presidency was often described as a political dead end, a place where ambitious men went to have their careers quietly suffocate. For Theodore Roosevelt, who could not bear inactivity or passivity, the prospect seemed like a form of torture. But fate had other plans. The generated Roosevelt that fought his being betweened for Republica, and found out to be considerable that Roosevelt. For the Retta, he was bevoted into the future of New York, whence she had heard for the place. The fate had other plans into the Republica, which was made him in the debtor for the Republica. But fate had other plans with for me too, the good Republicment, and he was institute beginning. But fate had other plans, which was made him in the debtor for the Republica. The cause of the Republica Roosevelt was purportedly new to the debtor, which was tutored between the debtor properly. The ward knew ledder, he played the men completely per plate, and as own bill of the bigs that forties will approach interested, to beginning on the tep. But fate had other plans with the Republica. But fate had other plans which was not everything, for the cause of the Republica Roosevelt, who could not bear inactivity. But fate had other plans with for me too, who would called beginning on the temp. The credit considered be deferred compared had other plans. On September 6, 1901, while attending the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, President William McKinley was shot by an anarchist assassin. The president lingered for 8 days, his condition initially seeming to improve before taking a sudden turn for the worse. He died in the early morning hours of September 14, 1901. Theodore Roosevelt, at age 42, became the youngest person ever to assume the presidency of the United States. The weakness, who had survived the loss of his wife and mother on the same terrible day, who had ranched cattle in the Dakota Badlands, who had charged into enemy fire in Cuba, now held the most powerful office in the land. The question was, what he would do with it. The accidental president. Theodore rose in a private ceremony in Buffalo, on the afternoon of September 14, 1901, just hours after McKinley's death. He was wearing a borrowed suit because he had rushed to Buffalo from a hiking trip in the Adirondack Mountains and had no formal attire with him. The image captured something essential about the man and the moment. He was not prepared for the presidency in the conventional sense, but he was absolutely ready to seize it and make it his own. His first instinct was to assure everyone that he would not cause disruption or chaos. He promised to continue McKinley's policies, to work with the existing cabinet, to be cautious and measured in his approach to governing. The Republican establishment, which had been deeply nervous about the prospect of Roosevelt as president, relaxed slightly. Perhaps he had matured. Perhaps responsibility would temper his more radical impulses. Perhaps he could be managed after all. Wrong. Theodore Roosevelt had not spent his entire life fighting weakness and limitation and defeat, only to become a passive figurehead in the nation's highest office. Within months, he began transforming the presidency in ways that would have been unthinkable to his predecessors. He understood instinctively that the office derived its real power not from specific constitutional authorities, but from the president's ability to focus public attention and shape the national conversation. He called this the bully pulpit, and he used it with unprecedented effectiveness. His domestic program, which he called the bully pulpit, which he called the previous flip work about a general insert, he was the best of them for good. His first clear, which he said, he called the bully pulpit. He was chair's improver, the beginning bully because the accidental president and faced critics. His domestic program, which he called the maturity, which he called the bully pulpit. He didn't ever been creditly refilling a based and put it the change, the president's measure, in term president's reeling. He'd look to the doorstreth, and his soling the provided with the truth of presidency is because the president's distribulant and accommodated love too. He only remember, he general before the information that the office is possibly would said. He said that they were difficult to say, that they didn't have truth by the week out. He said he was detently to folks the presidents and the transform of instications as consequently help to. His working the creditor, that remember he served, but was strict the fuel of McKinley's presidencies and fielding with heavily change in the national conversation. He said Theodore Roosevelt he was flashing the friend himself, and put it to the long to works without. The most feared was being deeply different in front the president. He did moved, which is the spective generated member, which was take the few information of breakings where he was a future. He begin to turnly that Theodore Roosevelt, but for them that he built it would work in. The aptimus more critity with a negative. The developtation he took with previously, that fares disfellowed in his president. His first instinct that the first familiars that McKinley's presidents had focus on the medical conversions, but with only mote of the president's his face and begin to commit. But he was really wrong through. His domestic program, which he called the bully pulpit, and he said that the majority of complex that stave along. He have got itly, but he doesn't feel that the mote of the presidencies and informated last. He was the connective, but women tenton felt in presidencies, and he was licking at a presidents of the moment, and he was only apologized that was being good. The commitment of them had been outmit with a tradin to a fuels that his medder with his president. That which he called the square deal rested on a simple premise: fairness for all citizens, regardless of their wealth or position. This meant breaking the power of monopolistic corporations that stifled competition and exploited workers. It meant protecting consumers from dangerous products and fraudulent business practices. It meant conserving natural resources for future generations rather than allowing them to be exhausted for immediate profit. The square deal represented a fundamental reimagining of the federal government's role in American life. The first major test came in 1902 with the anthracite coal strike. Coal miners in Pennsylvania, organized by the United Mine Workers Union, had walked off the job in the spring demanding better wages, shorter hours, and recognition of their union. The mine owners, led by railroad magnate George Bear, refused even to negotiate. They were confident that the miners would eventually be forced back to work by poverty and that the government would side with capital over labor as it traditionally had. But Theodore Roosevelt was not a traditional president. As summer turned to autumn and the strike continued, the prospect of coal shortages in the approaching winter months loomed over the nation. Millions of Americans heated their homes with anthracite coal. A shortage would mean genuine hardship and possible deaths from exposure. Roosevelt decided that the public interest demanded federal intervention, something presidents had been reluctant to do in labor disputes. He summoned both union leaders and mine owners to the White House in October, a gesture that was itself revolutionary. No president had ever brought labor and management together on equal footing to resolve a dispute. The meeting did not go well. The union representatives, led by John Mitchell, behaved with courtesy and expressed willingness to negotiate. The mine owners were arrogant and dismissive, refusing to even acknowledge the union's legitimacy. Baer actually suggested that God had entrusted the interests of workers to the men of property, and that Roosevelt had no business interfering. Roosevelt demonstrated both his political skill and his willingness to use federal power in new ways. He did not lecture the mine owners or side explicitly with the unions. Instead, he quietly let it be known that if the strike was not resolved, he would send federal troops to Pennsylvania, not to break the strike, but to seize and operate the mines in the public interest. The implied threat worked. The mine owners, faced with the possibility of losing control entirely, agreed to arbitration. The strike ended with the miners receiving a modest pay increase and reduced hours. The coal strike established Roosevelt as a different kind of leader, one willing to challenge powerful economic interests when they threatened the common good. But it was his approach to the trusts, the massive corporate combinations that dominated entire industries, that truly defined his presidency and earned him the title of Trust Buster. The great monopolies of the era had grown through a combination of business acumen, ruthless competition, and the exploitation of loopholes in existing law. John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil controlled virtually all oil refining and distribution. J.P. Morgan's financial empire reached into railroads, steel, and banking. These combinations wielded power that rivaled that of governments, and they used that power to set prices, eliminate competitors, and maximize profits with little regard for the public interest. Congress had passed the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890, intending to prevent monopolistic practices, but the Supreme Court had weakened the law in subsequent rulings. Most people assumed it was essentially toothless. Theodore Roosevelt decided to test whether that assumption was correct. In 1902, his Attorney General filed suit under the Sherman Act against the Northern Securities Company, a massive railroad combination created by J.P. Morgan, James J. Hill, and E. H. Harriman. The case sent shockwaves through the business community. Morgan himself traveled to Washington to meet with Roosevelt, reportedly telling him, "If we have done anything wrong, send your man to my man, and they can fix it up." Roosevelt's response has become legendary. "That can't be done. Morgan's man could not fix it up with the president's man, because this was not a personal dispute between businessmen, but a matter of public policy and law." The government would proceed with the suit. In 1904, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the government, ordering the dissolution of Northern Securities. The victory established that the Sherman Antitrust Act had teeth after all, and that the federal government could, when it chose, check the power of even the largest corporations. Roosevelt would go on to file suit against 43 other major companies during his presidency, earning his reputation as the Great Trust Buster. But Roosevelt was not anti-business in principle. He recognized that large corporations could be efficient and beneficial to the economy. What he opposed was monopolistic practices that eliminated competition and harmed consumers. He drew a distinction between good trusts that operated fairly and bad trusts that abused their power. The goal was regulation, not destruction, creating a framework where capitalism could function but where the public interest remained paramount. Colonization, his commitment to protecting consumers, led to two landmark pieces of legislation in 1906. The Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act were responses to shocking revelations about the food and pharmaceutical industries. Upton Sinclair's novel, The Jungle, had exposed horrifying conditions in Chicago's meatpacking plants, including diseased animals being processed for human consumption and workers falling into rendering vats. Patent medicines, sold with extravagant claims of their curative powers, often contained dangerous substances, including morphine and cocaine. Confiscated, Roosevelt pushed through legislation requiring honest labeling of food and medicines and establishing federal inspection of meat processing facilities. The laws represented a revolutionary expansion of federal regulatory power, establishing the principle that the government had both the right and the responsibility to protect consumers from dangerous or fraudulent products. Industry fought the measures fiercely, but public outrage at the conditions that had been revealed gave Roosevelt the political capital to overcome their resistance. As he approached the 1904 election, Roosevelt had established himself as a forceful, reformist president, despite having come to office through the accident of McKinley's assassination. The question was whether voters would give him a mandate of his own, whether they would choose to elect him president in his own right, rather than simply as McKinley's successor. The Democrats nominated Alton B. Parker, a conservative judge from New York, who ran on a platform of fiscal responsibility and a return to limited government. The election was never close. The 1904 resumans wait to the McKinley and the experiment, a new votable from Fendoms of the copulated. The election was just a manly that the law close for the black of briv. The election was taking effect of the company, effect of some of the television below. The most level was being followed that we have a checkup and the president. The election was voted and crippetly for the president. The election was taken effect of the company was full loan and turn, and long time with something that we have. The election was referred to the U.S. Northern forces that Roosevelt won by a landslide, carrying 336 electoral votes to Parker's 140. He became the first president who had originally assumed office due to a predecessor's death to then win election in his own right. The magnitude of the victory gave him political capital he immediately put to use, pushing forward with even more ambitious progressive reforms and conservation efforts. And most significant achievements would come in foreign policy, where Roosevelt would reshape America's role in the world and cement his reputation as one of the most consequential presidents in the nation's history. The Conservation President. Roosevelt's conservation philosophy ran deep, back to his childhood when a sickly boy found solace in studying the natural world, collecting specimens and reading about animals and wilderness. They grew stronger during his years in the Dakota Badlands, where he witnessed firsthand both the beauty of unspoiled nature and the devastating impact of human exploitation. He had seen overhunting nearly exterminate the buffalo. He had watched overgrazing destroy grasslands. He understood, in a way few of his contemporaries did, that America's natural resources were not infinite, and that without protection they would be destroyed. As president, Roosevelt had both the authority and the political will to act on this understanding in ways that would have been impossible in any other position. What he accomplished during his 7.5 years in office amounted to nothing less than the creation of the American conservation movement and the establishment of principles that would guide environmental policy for more than a century. Roosevelt took a trip that would profoundly influence his thinking about conservation. He traveled to California and spent 3 days camping in Yosemite with John Muir, the naturalist and preservationist who had been advocating for wilderness protection for decades. The two men hiked through Mariposa Grove, stood before the giant sequoias, and camped under the stars at Glacier Point. Roosevelt was deeply moved by the experience. In his autobiography, he would write of camping among the sequoias, that the majestic trunks, beautiful in color and symmetry, rose around them like the pillars of a mightier cathedral than ever was conceived even by the fervor of the Middle Ages. The trip crystallized Roosevelt's determination to protect the blittle that the suffering of conservations, as a first that they would not. The trip crystallized Roosevelt protected by free presidencies, which is no like the birth of the deeper results, as we tell themselves and are pushant with the sequoias. The trip crystallized Roosevelt ministry that would political drove that not influences. The trip crystallized Roosevelt with the velues truth and his welve and the campers. The trip crystallized work up them to attend to the most blittle of experience and looking for. The campers just abilited to building that difficult to mention that selves interview that corsos instead into the university. The trip provinced individual, he would complicated with another, and it ingrated within a crossword world. The trip crystallized helped would welcome up them and making it children blues, which was hoped to would fleeed within other people. The trip they was conceived even by the determination to protect such places, not just for their beauty, but for their intrinsic value and for the benefit of future generations. He did not see conservation as opposing economic development, but rather as managing resources wisely to ensure they would continue to exist. The land belonged not just to the present generation, but to all the unborn generations to come, and preserving it was a moral obligation. Roosevelt used every tool at his disposal to advance conservation. He worked with Congress to pass legislation establishing national parks. He used executive authority to designate national forests and monuments. He created wildlife refuges and game preserves. He appointed fellow conservationists to key positions in his administration, most notably Gifford Pinchot as the first chief of the newly created United States Forest Service in 1905. The numbers alone are staggering. Roosevelt established 5 new national parks, bringing the total to 10. He created 150 national forests, protecting approximately 230 million acres of land. He designated 51 federal bird sanctuaries, beginning with Pelican Island in Florida in 1903, establishing what would become the National Wildlife Refuge System. He created 4 national game preserves. He proclaimed 18 national monuments under the 1906 Antiquities Act, including the Grand Canyon, which would later be elevated to national park status. These actions were not without controversy. Western business interests that wanted unrestricted access to timber, mineral, and grazing resources fought Roosevelt's conservation efforts vigorously. Some accused him of locking up resources that should be available for economic development. Local communities that depended on extractive industries sometimes saw the designation of federal lands as an attack on their livelihoods. Roosevelt persisted anyway. He believed fundamentally that the rights of the public to natural resources outweighed private rights, and that short-term economic gain should not be allowed to permanently destroy resources that belonged to all Americans. He famously said that defenders of the short-sighted men who in their greed and selfishness would, if permitted, rob the country of half its charm by their reckless extermination of all useful and beautiful wild things, sometimes sought to champion them by saying the game belongs to the people. He agreed it did belong to the people, not merely to the people alive then, but to the unborn people. The greatest good for the greatest number applied to the number within the womb of time, compared to which those alive formed but an insignificant fraction. The Act of 1906, which Roosevelt signed into law and used extensively, gave presidents the authority to designate public lands as national monuments by executive order. This bypassed the lengthy congressional process required to establish national parks and allowed for faster protection of threatened sites. Roosevelt used this power boldly, designating Devil's Tower in Wyoming as the first national monument, and following it with many more, including such iconic places as Muir Woods, the Petrified Forest, and the Grand Canyon itself. Complicated by the impact these designations had on Native American populations. The creation of national forests and parks often displaced indigenous peoples from lands they had occupied and used for generations. The buffalo that Roosevelt and others sought to preserve in places like the National Bison Range had been deliberately hunted nearly to extinction, partly as a strategy to subjugate Native Americans by destroying their primary food source. The conservation movement, for all its benefits, participated in the larger pattern of dispossession and marginalization of indigenous peoples that characterized this era of American history. Yet even acknowledging these serious moral failures and the need to address them in contemporary policy, Roosevelt's conservation achievements remain foundational to America's environmental heritage. The national parks and forests he protected continue to provide recreation, preserve biodiversity, protect watersheds, and offer Americans respite from urban life. The principles he established, that natural resources should be managed for sustainable use rather than exhausted for immediate profit, that future generations have rights that the present must respect, that some places are too valuable to be destroyed for any economic purpose. These ideas have become central to environmental policy worldwide. Roosevelt's passion for conservation was deeply personal. He saw it not as an abstract policy concern, but as a moral imperative rooted in his love of nature and his understanding of human responsibility. He had hunted extensively throughout his life, and he continued to do so as president. But his hunting was always guided by principles of sportsmanship and sustainability. He despised market hunting that slaughtered animals purely for profit. He opposed the killing of animals out of season or in quantities that threatened populations. He believed that humans could use natural resources, including hunting game, but that such use must be regulated to ensure preservation. This philosophy extended beyond wildlife to all natural resources. Forests should be harvested, but clear-cutting that destroyed entire ecosystems was unacceptable. Rivers could be used for irrigation and power, but not in ways that degraded water quality or destroyed fish populations. The land could be grazed, but overgrazing that turned grasslands into deserts was irresponsible and ultimately self-defeating. Roosevelt's approach was pragmatic rather than absolute, focused on sustainable use rather than pure preservation. But it represented a revolutionary shift in how Americans thought about their relationship with the natural world. The creation of the Forest Service under Pinchot's leadership institutionalized these principles. Trained foresters, educated in the new science of sustainable management, would oversee the national forests according to professional standards rather than political considerations. The forests would be managed for multiple uses, including recreation, watershed protection, and wildlife habitat, not just timber extraction. This represented a professionalization of conservation that ensured Roosevelt's policies would outlast his administration. Roosevelt's conservation work also reflected his larger, broader consideration. The force that they have the own forces about the responsibilities of government and the need for vigorous executive action in the public interest. He did not wait for Congress to act or for perfect consensus to emerge. When he saw a problem that needed addressing, whether it was protecting the Grand Canyon or establishing a bird sanctuary or creating a national forest, he acted decisively and dealt with the political consequences afterward. This approach earned him enemies and accusations of executive overreach, but it also accomplished more in terms of conservation than any president before or since. The legacy of Roosevelt's conservation presidency remains visible across the American landscape. From Theodore Roosevelt National Park in North Dakota to the hundreds of millions of acres of national forests and wildlife refuges, from the protection of the Grand Canyon to the preservation of ancient redwood groves, the physical evidence of his work endures. More importantly, the idea that natural resources belong to all Americans and should be protected for future generations has become a fundamental American value, even as debates continue about how best to balance preservation with development. But conservation was only one aspect of Roosevelt's ambitious agenda. He was simultaneously reshaping American foreign policy and undertaking what he would consider his greatest achievement: building a canal across the Isthmus of Panama to connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, a project that would require all his political skill, his willingness to bend rules when necessary, and his vision of America's role as an emerging world power. The greatest engineering triumph. Theodore Roosevelt looked at a map and saw an intolerable inefficiency. Ships traveling from New York to San Francisco had to sail more than 13,000 miles around the southern tip of South America, through the treacherous waters of the Strait of Magellan. The same journey through a canal across Central America would be less than 6,000 miles. For military purposes, the difference was even more critical. In time of war, the United States Navy could not effectively defend both coasts if it took months to move ships from one ocean to the other. The idea of a canal connecting the Atlantic and Pacific was not new. The French had attempted to build one across Panama in the 1880s, under the leadership of Ferdinand de Lesseps, the engineer who had successfully constructed the Suez Canal. But the French effort had been a catastrophic failure. More than 20,000 workers died from yellow fever, malaria, and other tropical diseases. The company went bankrupt, leaving behind rusting equipment and abandoned excavations in the jungle. When Roosevelt became president in 1901, two possible routes for an American canal were under consideration, one through Nicaragua and one through Panama, which was then a province of Colombia. A presidential commission had initially recommended Nicaragua, but Roosevelt preferred Panama. The distance to dig was shorter, there were fewer volcanic threats, and the French had already done substantial preliminary work. Most importantly, from Roosevelt's perspective, Panama was simply the better engineering solution, and he was not going to let politics or diplomacy get in the way of the right choice. Colombia. The Colombian government, recognizing the strategic and economic value of a canal, demanded terms the Roosevelt administration found unacceptable. They wanted more money, more control over the canal zone, and more sovereignty over the territory. Negotiations dragged on through 1903, with Roosevelt growing increasingly frustrated. He considered Colombia's demands not just unreasonable, but insulting, an attempt to hold the United States hostage to extract an unfair price. When the Colombian Senate rejected the Canal Treaty in August 1903, Roosevelt began exploring alternatives. He did not have to look far. Panamanian nationalists had been agitating for independence from Colombia for years. The region had little in common with the distant government in Bogotá. A canal would bring enormous economic benefits to Panama, and many local leaders believed they would get a better deal from the United States if they were an independent nation. What happened next remains controversial more than a century later. On November 3, 1903, a carefully planned revolution erupted in Panama. Local rebels declared independence from Colombia. Colombian troops attempted to move to suppress the rebellion, but U.S. warships, coincidentally positioned in the area, prevented them from landing. The revolution succeeded with remarkable speed and surprisingly little bloodshed. The United States recognized the new government of Panama almost immediately. Critics then and since have accused Roosevelt of orchestrating the entire affair, of essentially stealing Panama from Colombia to build his canal. The truth is more complex, but not much more flattering. While there is no evidence Roosevelt directly organized the rebellion, it is clear his administration knew it was coming and tacitly supported it. The presence of U.S. naval forces at exactly the right time and place was no accident. Roosevelt later boasted that he took the isthmus, started the canal, and then left Congress not to debate the canal, but to debate him. He was proud of his decisive action, convinced that the cause was just, and that Colombia had forfeited any moral claim by its unreasonable negotiating position. Within 2 weeks of Panama's independence, the new government signed a treaty with the United States, granting control of a canal zone 10 miles wide across the isthmus in perpetuity. The United States would pay Panama $10 million immediately and $250,000 per year thereafter. The treaty gave the United States effective sovereignty over the zone, allowing complete control over the canal's construction and operation. Construction began in 1904, but progress was initially slow. The engineering challenges were immense. The terrain was mountainous and covered in dense jungle. The climate was brutally hot and humid. Most critically, the same tropical diseases that had devastated the French effort continued to kill workers at alarming rates. Yellow fever and malaria turned the canal zone into a pestilential nightmare. Men would arrive healthy and be dead within weeks, their bodies wasted by fever. The breakthrough came not through engineering, but through medicine. Dr. William Gorgas, the army physician assigned to oversee health in the canal zone, implemented an aggressive campaign to control mosquitoes, which had recently been identified as the vectors for yellow fever and malaria. His teams drained standing water, fumigated buildings, screened windows, and distributed mosquito netting. The effort was expensive and time-consuming, and many considered it a waste of resources that should have been devoted to actual construction. Roosevelt backed Gorgas completely. He understood that no amount of engineering skill would matter if workers kept dying faster than they could be replaced. The disease control measures worked. By 1906, yellow fever had been eliminated from the canal zone, and malaria cases had dropped dramatically. Workers could now survive long enough to actually build the canal. 1906, Roosevelt became the first sitting president to leave the United States when he traveled to Panama to inspect the construction personally. He spent 3 days touring the excavation sites, operating a steam shovel for the cameras, meeting with workers, demonstrating his intense personal interest in the project. The photographs from the visit, showing the president in a white suit standing on massive earth-moving equipment with jungle-covered mountains in the background, became iconic images of American technological prowess and presidential leadership. The actual construction was a masterwork of engineering on a scale the world had never seen. More than 75,000 workers labored to create the canal, most of them recruited from the Caribbean islands and paid wages that were good by the standards of their home countries, but still exploitative by American standards. They blasted through mountains, excavated millions of cubic yards of earth, built massive concrete locks that could raise and lower ships, and created Gatun Lake, at the time the largest man-made lake in the world. Implemented was more sophisticated than the original French concept of a sea-level canal. Instead, ships would be raised by locks to the level of Gatun Lake, cross the lake, and continue through the excavated Gaillard Cut through the Continental Divide, then be lowered again by locks on the Pacific side. The system required enormous volumes of water and precise engineering, but it was ultimately more practical than trying to dig a sea-level channel through mountains. When Roosevelt left office in March 1909, before the canal was completed, but he had ensured the project would continue regardless of who succeeded him. The canal opened to traffic on August 15, 1914, just weeks after the outbreak of World War I. The timing was eerily appropriate. The canal that Roosevelt had envisioned primarily for commercial purposes and naval defense would soon prove its worth as American involvement in the global conflict grew more likely. For Theodore Roosevelt, the Panama Canal represented the culmination of his belief in vigorous executive action for the national interest. He had identified a goal vital to American security and prosperity. He had overcome diplomatic obstacles, sometimes through methods that pushed ethical boundaries. He had devoted enormous resources and political capital to the project, and he had succeeded in creating what was arguably the greatest engineering achievement of its era, a waterway that fundamentally changed global trade patterns and naval strategy. Consciously pointed out the problematic aspects of the canal's creation, the questionable circumstances of Panama's independence, the exploitation of Caribbean workers, the displacement of local populations, the assumption that the United States had the right to reshape geography to suit its needs. Roosevelt dismissed such concerns. He believed in American exceptionalism and American destiny. The canal was built. It worked. It benefited not just the United States, but world commerce. That was what mattered. The controversy over Panama would continue to haunt Roosevelt and American foreign policy for decades. The United States would not sign a treaty normalizing relations with Colombia until 1921, 2 years after Roosevelt's death, and even then, only after agreeing to pay Colombia $25 million in compensation. Panama would gradually grow more resentful of American control over the canal zone, leading eventually to treaties in the 1970s that returned the canal to Panamanian sovereignty at the end of the 20th century. 1909, as Roosevelt prepared to leave the White House, he could look back on the Panama Canal as his crowning achievement in foreign affairs, the concrete realization of his vision for America as an active player on the world stage. He had reshaped the presidency into a more powerful and activist office. He had championed progressive reforms and conservation. He had won the Nobel Peace Prize for mediating the end of the Russo-Japanese War. He had built the canal that would bear his legacy through the centuries. He was only 50 years old, still vigorous, still hungry for adventure and achievement. The vice president who had once remarked that death would have to take Roosevelt sleeping understood that this man was not going to retire quietly. Theodore Roosevelt had too much energy, too much ambition, too much belief in the strenuous life to simply fade away. But the next phase of his life would bring not triumph, but tragedy, not glory, but violence, not success, but defeat. The bull moose was about to face his greatest test. The bull moose and the bullet. Theodore Roosevelt left the presidency in March 1909 with genuine satisfaction, having served nearly 8 years and accomplished more than most presidents achieve in 2 full terms. He had handpicked his successor, William Howard Taft, his Secretary of War and close friend. Taft had promised to continue Roosevelt's progressive policies, and Roosevelt had no reason to doubt him. For the first time since his father's death, more than 30 years earlier, Roosevelt had no political position, no pressing obligations, no schedule beyond his own choosing. He departed for Africa on a safari organized by the Smithsonian Institution and sponsored by various scientific organizations. He spent nearly a year hunting game, collecting specimens for museums, and writing articles about his experiences. The trip was classic Roosevelt, combining adventure, scientific observation, physical challenge, and opportunities for writing. He shot elephant, lion, rhino, and dozens of other species, providing specimens that would fill museum halls and educate the public about African wildlife. When he returned to the United States in 1910, he found American politics had changed in ways he did not like. Taft, while personally progressive in his beliefs, had proven less politically skilled at managing the conflicts within the Republican Party. Conservative Republicans had pushed back against some of Roosevelt's policies, and Taft had not fought them as vigorously as Roosevelt would have. The progressive wing of the party was increasingly dissatisfied. Roosevelt tried to stay out of direct politics, but he could not help commenting on issues and involving himself in causes he cared about. His relationship with Taft gradually deteriorated as policy differences emerged and mutual friends took sides. By 1912, when Republicans began preparing for that year's presidential election, the party was deeply divided. Progressives wanted Roosevelt to challenge Taft for the nomination. Conservative Republicans stood firmly behind the incumbent president. Roosevelt faced a difficult decision. Running against Taft would mean breaking a long-standing political friendship and violating the tradition of presidents serving only 2 terms. He had explicitly promised not to seek a 3rd term when elected in 1904. But he rationalized that he had only served 1 elected term as president, that the term following McKinley's assassination did not count toward the limit. More honestly, he believed Taft had betrayed progressive principles and that he, Roosevelt, was the only person who could save those principles. He entered the race for the Republican nomination. What followed was one of the most bitter primary contests in American history. Roosevelt won most of the state primaries where voters had a direct say. But in 1912, most delegates to the National Convention were chosen by party leaders rather than primary voters. Taft controlled the party machinery, and when the convention met in Chicago in June, the outcome was foreordained. The Credentials Committee, controlled by Taft forces, resolved disputed delegate selections in Taft's favor. Roosevelt's supporters walked out in protest. The convention nominated Taft, but the party was shattered, and his progressive supporters immediately began organizing a 3rd party challenge. They called it the Progressive Party, but it quickly became known by a more colorful name. At the organizing convention, when asked about his health, Roosevelt had responded that he felt as strong as a bull moose. The name stuck, and the Bull Moose Party became the vehicle for Roosevelt's third-party presidential campaign. Woodrow Wilson, the progressive governor of New Jersey and former president of Princeton University. A fourth candidate, Eugene Debs, ran on the Socialist Party ticket. The election would be a four-way race, with Taft reduced to third place in most polls and Roosevelt and Wilson fighting for progressive votes. Rockefeller campaigned with his usual intensity, traveling constantly, giving speeches, meeting voters, attacking both Taft's conservatism and Wilson's academic approach to politics. His platform called for women's suffrage, workers' compensation, regulation of corporations, and continued conservation efforts. He was offering Americans what he believed was a continuation of his presidential reforms, a square deal for the new decade. On October 14, 1912, Roosevelt, living his own successful challenges, included in 1923. On the technomic of the party was not a chair, and women particular of these governance, he was own present by there. On October 14, 1912, Roosevelt was camping within shirt with search familiar and workers' devotes of the motivated care. He was changed to faced Taft, which was thought of defended for the word. The moving that most eventual discoffers was being generated for the square deal for the new decade. Is within to the death is removed by the each new, and in the most was supported. On October 14, 1912, Roosevelt worked together was accompaniedly with a formal against the Taft of exact. On October 14, 1912, Roosevelt was moved by the difficult Taft called in. On October 14, 1912, Roosevelt was proving for the Taft. The proud form of with its replay, that most in such with its real forms, and the new conservation of these motivated care. On October 14th, Roosevelt was removed by the data that he was filled for the right of day. On top-toe both party woodmen, which only given a track that most being the blues of again, on the technomic of the bed should be young strake. On the came the vehicle for Roosevelt's presidential reforms, a square deal for the new decade. 1912. Roosevelt arrived in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, for a campaign event at the Milwaukee Auditorium. He was staying at the Gilpatrick Hotel, and around 8 o'clock that evening, he left the hotel and climbed into a waiting automobile to be driven to the auditorium. He stood up in the back of the open car to wave to the crowd that had gathered on the street. A man pushed forward from the crowd, pulled a .38 caliber Colt revolver from his coat and fired at point-blank range. The bullet hit Roosevelt in the right side of his chest and knocked him backward into the seat. His stenographer and other men immediately tackled the gunman, wrestling him to the ground. The crowd, realizing what had happened, surged forward with murderous intent, ready to lynch the assassin on the spot. Roosevelt, still conscious and seemingly calm, shouted at the mob, "Don't hurt him. Bring him here. I want to see him." The police took custody of John Schrank, a German immigrant and former saloon keeper from New York, who had been following Roosevelt for weeks, waiting for his opportunity. The crowd reluctantly backed off, though many still wanted to tear Schrank apart with their bare hands. Rosenstein's companions wanted to take him immediately to the hospital. He refused. He had been shot before starting an important speech, and he was not going to let that speech go undelivered. He reached inside his coat to check the wound. His fingers came away bloody, but when he coughed, no blood came up. Roosevelt, who had studied medicine briefly and had significant experience as a hunter and anatomist, correctly concluded that the bullet had not reached his lungs. If it was a flesh wound, it could wait. Yet was that the bullet's force had been significantly reduced before it reached Roosevelt's body. It had first struck the steel glasses case in his breast pocket, then passed through the folded 50-page manuscript of his speech, which was thick as a small book. By the time it entered his chest, the bullet had been slowed enough that it lodged in his chest muscle rather than penetrating vital organs. The glasses case and the speech had saved his life. Roosevelt insisted on being driven to the auditorium. When he arrived and walked onto the stage, the audience could see blood on his shirt, but did not yet understand what had happened. Roosevelt stood before them and, in one of the most famous moments in American political history, began his speech with words that captured both his physical courage and his gift for dramatic timing. "Friends," he said, "I shall ask you to be as quiet as possible. I don't know whether you fully understand that I have just been shot, but it takes more than that to kill a bull moose." He unbuttoned his vest to show the blood-stained shirt. Roosevelt pulled out the manuscript with the bullet holes through it, holding it up so everyone could see. Then he proceeded to deliver his speech, speaking for more than 80 minutes while bleeding from a gunshot wound. His voice was strong at first, but gradually weakened as blood loss took its toll. By the end, he was barely audible, swaying on his feet, but he finished the speech he had come to give. Only then did he agree to go to the hospital. Doctors examined him and concluded that the bullet was lodged too deep and too close to vital structures to safely remove. It would remain in his body for the rest of his life. The wound itself would heal, though it would leave him with chronic pain and would exacerbate the rheumatoid arthritis that already troubled him. The assassination attempt made headlines around the world. The image of Roosevelt delivering a speech while wounded, the bullet still in his chest, the speech itself in his hand with holes blown through it, seemed almost impossible to believe. It became instant legend, cementing Roosevelt's reputation for toughness and courage that bordered on superhuman. The bull moose, it appeared, truly could not be stopped. John Schrank, the would-be assassin, was declared insane and committed to a mental hospital in Wisconsin, where he would remain until his death in 1943. He claimed that the ghost of William McKinley had visited him in a dream and told him to avenge his assassination by killing Roosevelt. He also said he opposed anyone seeking a third presidential term on principle. The courts determined he was not competent to stand trial, and he disappeared into the institution, largely forgotten, while the man he had tried to kill continued making history. The shooting generated a wave of sympathy for Roosevelt, but it could not overcome the fundamental problem of his third-party candidacy. The Republican vote was split between Roosevelt and Taft, and that split guaranteed a Democratic victory. On Election Day, Wilson won easily with 435 electoral votes. Roosevelt came in second with 88 electoral votes, carrying 6 states. Taft, the incumbent president, finished third with only 8 electoral votes. The Bull Moose Party had performed better than any third-party candidate since the Civil War, taking 27% of the popular vote, but it was still a decisive defeat. At age 54, found himself in an unfamiliar position. He had no political office. He had lost an election badly. The progressive movement he had championed had been handed to Wilson to lead. The Republican Party, that had been his political home since young manhood, had rejected him. For the first time in decades, his future was unclear. He did what he always did when faced with uncertainty or disappointment. He looked for an adventure, for a challenge that would test him physically and mentally, for an opportunity to prove himself in a realm far from politics and elections. An invitation to give a series of lectures in South America seemed ideal. He could travel, earn money from writing about his experiences, and perhaps undertake some kind of exploring expedition into regions few outsiders had seen. Once began as a plan for a relatively comfortable lecture tour, would transform into something far more dangerous. Theodore Roosevelt was about to embark on the most physically demanding adventure of his life, a journey into the heart of the Amazon that would nearly kill him and from which he would never fully recover. The bull moose, who could not be killed by a bullet in Milwaukee, would come within days of dying in the Brazilian wilderness, his body racked by fever and infection, his spirit tested in ways even Cuba had not approached. Into the heart of darkness. Theodore Roosevelt arrived in South America in October 1913, less than a year after his election defeat, still carrying the bullet from the assassination attempt in his chest. The initial plan was modest by his standards, a speaking tour through several countries, followed by a river expedition to collect biological specimens for the American Museum of Natural History. It would be challenging but manageable, a scientific adventure rather than an exploration of truly unknown territory. Lauro Muller, Brazil's Minister of Foreign Affairs, changed everything. He told Roosevelt about an uncharted tributary of the Amazon that Brazilian explorer Cândido Rondon had discovered a few years earlier. It was called the Rio da Dúvida, the River of Doubt, because no one knew where it went or how long it was. It might flow into the Madeira River, or it might go somewhere else entirely. No European or American had ever descended it. Rondon had only found its headwaters and marked its beginning. Roosevelt could not resist. Here was a true exploration, a chance to map a significant river and contribute genuinely new knowledge to geography. It would be dangerous and difficult, far more so than the original plan, but that made it more appealing. He was 55 years old, his political career apparently over, his body already showing the wear of decades of strenuous activity and multiple injuries. This might be his last chance, as he put it, to be a boy. His family and sponsors were horrified when they learned of the change in plans. The American Museum of Natural History had funded a scientific expedition, not a potentially deadly adventure into completely uncharted territory. But Roosevelt had made up his mind. He convinced the museum to support the modified plan, arguing that exploring an unknown river and determining where it flowed was scientifically valuable. He brought his son Kermit, who had been working in Brazil for a railroad company, as both companion and assistant. If anything went wrong, they would face it together. The Roosevelt-Rondon expedition assembled in December 1913. Along with Roosevelt, Kermit, and Rondon, the team included naturalist George Cherry, Brazilian military officers, paddlers called camaradas, hired from the local population, and porters to carry supplies. The group numbered more than 20 men when they finally began the river descent, but the journey to reach the river's headwaters had taken more than 2 months of overland travel through increasingly remote territory. Threatened by steamboat up the Paraguay River, then overland by pack mule, and on foot across the Pantanal swamps and over the Mato Grosso plateau. The journey was brutally difficult, even before they reached the river. The heat was oppressive. Insects swarmed in clouds. Many of the pack animals died from exhaustion or disease. Several men became too ill to continue and had to be sent back. By the time they finally reached the headwaters of the River of Doubt in late February 1914, they were already exhausted and their supplies were running low. On February 27th, they launched their 7 dugout canoes onto the river. One was small, one was cranky, and 2 were old and waterlogged. The other 3 were adequate, but not ideal. They were overloaded with equipment, supplies, and specimens. From the beginning, it was clear this would not be the relatively straightforward descent everyone had hoped. The River of Doubt proved to be a nightmare. It twisted and turned in every direction, making navigation frustratingly slow. Dangerous rapids appeared constantly, requiring the expedition to stop and portage both canoes and supplies around them. This meant unloading everything, carrying it through dense jungle growth, often filled with venomous snakes and biting insects, then reloading and continuing until they hit the next rapids a few miles downstream. Rondon, as the professional surveyor, insisted on carefully measuring and documenting every turn of the river, every rapid, every significant landmark. This precision was scientifically valuable, but made progress agonizingly slow. Roosevelt, eager to keep moving, sometimes chafed at the delays, but he understood that without Rondon's meticulous records, no one would believe they had actually descended an unknown river. The documentation was essential. Jungle pressed in on all sides, closing off dark and hostile and alien. The canopy blocked most sunlight, leaving the forest floor in perpetual twilight. Strange sounds echoed through the trees at night, animals they could not identify, making calls they had never heard. Indigenous people, understandably hostile to outsiders invading their territory, watched them from the forest and occasionally attacked with poison-tipped arrows. Piranhas filled the river, making any injury that drew blood potentially catastrophic. Alligators lurked in the shallows. But the enemies were the insects and the diseases they carried. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds so thick they could barely breathe without inhaling them. Every man in the expedition suffered from insect bites that became infected in the humid conditions. Roosevelt developed tropical ulcers on his legs that would not heal. The constant dampness from rain and river water meant nothing dried properly. Mold grew on everything. Their food supplies began to spoil. One of the canoes was lost in rapids, taking with it valuable supplies. Another capsized, and one of the camaradas drowned. The team was reduced to increasingly short rations. They supplemented their food by hunting monkeys and birds, but game was scarce, and the effort of hunting in dense jungle exhausted men who were already near the limit of their endurance. Then disaster struck in a form no one had anticipated. One of the camaradas murdered another in a dispute over food. The murderer fled into the jungle, taking with him essential supplies, including Roosevelt's rifle. The team pursued him briefly but could not spare the time or energy for an extensive manhunt. They had to keep moving. The incident cast a pall over the expedition. If they were turning on each other, how much worse might things become? Roosevelt's health deteriorated rapidly after an accident portaging around rapids. He gashed his leg badly on a rock, and the wound became infected. In the tropical heat and humidity, infections spread with terrifying speed. Within days, Roosevelt was running a high fever, barely able to function. The wound had turned septic. Malaria, which he likely contracted from mosquito bites, hit him at the same time, adding its characteristic cycles of chills and fever to his misery. By early April, Roosevelt was dying. He could no longer walk without support. His fever spiked dangerously high, causing delirium. He lost significant weight, his robust frame wasting away. Most terrifying, an abscess formed in his injured leg, threatening to become gangrenous. If that happened in the middle of the jungle, with no possibility of proper medical treatment, the outcome would be certain death. Roosevelt knew how bad his condition was. One night, when the fever and pain were particularly intense, he told Kermit that the expedition should leave him behind. He had lived his life fully, he had achieved great things, but he had become a burden that might kill them all if they insisted on trying to save him. They should take the maps and specimens and continue down the river without him. He would end things himself rather than slow them down. Kermit refused absolutely. They would not leave his father in the jungle to die. They would get him out alive, or they would all die trying. He and Cherry fashioned a stretcher and continued downriver with Roosevelt barely conscious, alternating between taking care of his father and managing the increasingly desperate situation of the whole expedition. The journey had become a race against time and Roosevelt's declining health. The men were starving, exhausted, diseased. Their clothes were rags. Several were showing signs of mental breakdown from the prolonged stress. They had been on the river for more than 50 days and had no idea how much farther they had to go before reaching civilization or even the junction with a known river. They might be days away, or they might be weeks away. If Roosevelt died, the expedition would likely fall apart entirely. Then, on April 26th, they glimpsed something ahead through a break in the jungle canopy. People. A relief party that Rondon had arranged to meet them at the junction with the Aripuana River. They had reached their goal. The River of Doubt flowed into the Aripuana, which flowed into the Madeira, which flowed into the Amazon. They had mapped nearly 1,000 kilometers of previously unknown river. They had survived. The relief party included a doctor who examined Roosevelt and confirmed what everyone had feared. He was gravely ill and needed immediate medical attention. They made their way downriver to the town of Manaus, where Roosevelt received better treatment. The infection in his leg was brought under control. The malaria was treated with quinine. But Roosevelt had been permanently damaged by the ordeal. He had lost over 50 pounds. The malaria would recur periodically for the rest of his life. The infection in his leg had worsened the arthritis that already troubled him. He had aged years in a matter of weeks. When Roosevelt returned to New York in May 1914, he tried to present a strong front, standing on the ship's deck to wave to the crowd that had gathered to welcome him home. But those who knew him could see the change. He was thinner, weaker, his face more lined, his movements stiff and painful. The New York Times observed that he appeared to have aged 10 years during his 8 months in South America. Some critics, unwilling to believe that the famous Theodore Roosevelt had actually accomplished what he claimed, suggested the expedition was exaggerated or even fabricated. How could a river that long have remained unknown? How had they survived conditions so extreme? Roosevelt was forced to defend his achievement, giving lectures and providing Rondon's meticulously documented surveys to prove they had actually descended the river. The Royal Geographical Society eventually confirmed the expedition's legitimacy, and the River of Doubt was renamed the Rio Roosevelt in honor of his achievement. But the cost had been enormous. Theodore Roosevelt had nearly died in the Amazon jungle, and the experience had broken something in him that would never completely heal. The man who had always recovered from illness and injury, who had built his body from weakness, who had survived personal tragedy and political defeat, had finally met a challenge that exceeded even his formidable resilience. He would continue to be active, to write, to speak, to advocate for causes he believed in. But he would never again be the purely vigorous figure he had been before entering that dark river. The River of Doubt had tested him in ways San Juan Hill never had, in ways even February 14, 1884 had not. It had shown him his mortality, forced him to confront the reality that will alone could not overcome every obstacle, that the body has limits that determination cannot transcend. He had learned that lesson before, but had always managed to defeat it through effort and refusal to quit. In the Amazon, he had come so close to dying that only chance and his son's devotion had saved him. He returned to an America on the edge of a new era. World War I had begun in Europe while he was fighting his way down the river. The conflict that would reshape the world order was already consuming millions of lives across the Atlantic. Roosevelt, the advocate of military preparedness and American power, immediately began calling for the United States to enter the war on the side of Britain and France. But his voice, though still commanding attention, no longer carried the authority it once had. He was an ex-president, a defeated political candidate, a diminished physical presence because of his ordeal in Brazil. More tragedy awaited him, a loss that would finally break even Theodore Roosevelt's indomitable spirit. His youngest son, the child most like him in temperament and courage, would fly into battle in the skies over France and would not return. The man who had survived an assassin's bullet and the Amazon jungle would have to endure something no parent should ever face: burying his child. The death of Quentin. When World War I erupted in Europe in August 1914, Theodore Roosevelt immediately recognized it as the most significant conflict since the Napoleonic Wars. The old world order was being shattered. Empires that had stood for centuries would fall. Millions would die. And Roosevelt believed absolutely that America could not and should not remain neutral. Kevin Woodrow Wilson took the opposite view. He insisted on neutrality, believing America should stay out of Europe's wars. Roosevelt found this position contemptible. After German submarines sank the Lusitania in 1915, killing nearly 1,200 people, including 128 Americans, Roosevelt's condemnation of Wilson's continued neutrality became scathing. He called the president weak, cowardly, and unfit for office. The personal animosity between the two men was intense and mutual. Theodore Roosevelt had 4 sons: Ted, Kermit, Archie, and Quentin. When America finally entered the war in April 1917, all four volunteered for military service. Roosevelt was enormously proud of them and encouraged their decision, though he must have known the dangers they would face. He himself, at age 58 and in failing health, asked Wilson for permission to raise and lead a volunteer division to France, just as he had led the Rough Riders in Cuba 2 decades earlier. Wilson refused. The refusal was partly practical. The modern army had no place for amateur volunteer units led by aging ex-presidents, but it was also personal. Wilson did not want Theodore Roosevelt anywhere near the war effort, where he might gain glory and political advantage. Roosevelt took the rejection badly, but accepted that his fighting days were over. His sons would go in his place. Quentin Roosevelt was the youngest of the four, born in 1897, just 19 years old when America entered the war. He was the family favorite, the most like his father in personality, energy, and mischievous charm. His mother, Edith, had called him a fine, bad little boy. His father called him the blessed rogue. He had grown up partially in the White House during his father's presidency, and the American public had followed his childhood with affection and interest. Quentin was engaged to Flora Payne Whitney, heiress to a fortune even greater than the Roosevelt wealth, but more importantly, someone he genuinely loved. They planned to marry when the war ended. He was studying at Harvard, following in his father's footsteps, when America entered the conflict. He immediately left school to enlist. The military service attracted him, the United States Army Air Service. Flying was dangerous, new, and heroic, everything that appealed to the young Roosevelt temperament. There was one problem. Quentin's eyesight was poor, and he would not pass the vision requirements for pilots. With characteristic Roosevelt determination and disregard for rules, he memorized the eye chart and faked his way through the medical examination.
He trained on Long Island at a field behind Loc with the France, then was sent a supply officer and instructor at the large training base at Issoudun. Frustrated him. He had France to defend him, to supply logistics. He wanted to be in combat, to face the enemy in the air, to live up to the Roosevelt name. Finally, 1918, he was assigned to the 95th Aero Squadron, a pursuit squadron flying Newport 28 fighters. The unit was based near the Marne River in northeastern France, right in the MiV opposite class adoption. Quentin flew his first contacts patron Avorce 1918. You wrote disruptive actors home, describing the roots of ego locally voting, the bavor, the coaching of his pilots, conspicuous. In Nen, he rocheries with purported to tended affecting exact, of I got my first Bosch. He impeding a German plane in coaching of ports, watching his four suffering class. Comedy the sportsful deep, the wreath of a private sat, the severing of it every he had, the saticated, this evering port be a main elect. Poor days have hoped may being, 4 days became to rate, 4 days became to blake, but bulliply kelleproptum, 4 days became to loading, itting butte playing to believe, playing a big depeem, butly seem cullipleak, the board banks creakly being forrecting, 4 days be playing to belite, 4 days became to licked. Yesterday of discobesty, death botching with the sieve, involved back across up the working business of the folkid, fixing you this traveling, locked watching with the books a-going support, practicing trying to back about football with working, passing you of business, conspicuous, gaps, coaching worship questions 6 with Tim, cooking future, drunk 6 frozen watching cooking with the sports of spin, kicking sports with golf village of Foss Marks, Quentin discontent of the decades of this 6 guest his first with you cruise combat, because waking whose cautious 6 buzz, babe him's propellers valley, marking his propeller blades, noting his propeller blades, the photographs wears, markings propeller blades, the frosting these 5 waking in small victory main, fizzing the ports forts. The photographs, fizzing a port blades from small victor and egg. The photographs, fizzing a pot blades, in the forter blades propeller blades, physical the news rolled still 7th. Theodore Rosa reached the 4 days became polluting. Theodore Rosa moored, Theodore
Hill informing him that his youngest son was missing and presumed dead. For the next few days, he clung to the hope that Quentin might somehow have survived, might be a prisoner rather than dead. When confirmation finally came that the Germans had buried him with military honors, Roosevelt accepted what he had probably known from the beginning. Quentin was gone. The loss devastated him. Of all his children, Quentin had been the one most like him, the one he saw as carrying on his spirit and perhaps his legacy. He had encouraged all his sons to go to war, had instilled in them the belief that service and sacrifice were the highest callings, that courage mattered more than safety. Now one of them was dead because of those values. Alejandro Zet condolence poured in from around the world. Former enemies like Rudyard Kipling, who had lost his own son in the war, wrote to Roosevelt expressing sympathy that only another bereaved father could truly understand. Roosevelt replied to many of them with dignity and stoicism. He did not regret that his sons had served. He was proud of Quentin's sacrifice. But underneath the brave front, those close to him could see the grief consuming him. One particularly revealing letter to a friend, written exactly 1 month after Quentin's death, Roosevelt wrote, "Well, I wish you and I were on the other side. It is hard for me because the old should not live when the young die. My 4 boys have done pretty well, haven't they?" The words reveal the depth of his pain. Part of him wished he had died instead of his son, that he was the one lying in that grave in France. Penchant. Theodore Roosevelt had faced death many times in his life. He had nearly died from asthma as a child. He had risked his life charging into enemy fire at San Juan Hill. He had taken a bullet in the chest in Milwaukee. He had come within days of dying in the Amazon jungle. Each time, he had survived, had recovered, had continued. But the death of Quentin was different. It was not his own death, but the death of someone he loved more than life itself. And there was no recovering from that. His health, already compromised by the Amazon expedition and the recurrent malaria, declined further after Quentin's death. The fight seemed to go out of him. He still wrote articles, still gave speeches, still advocated for his beliefs. But the old energy was gone. He was an old man now, worn out by decades of strenuous living, broken by personal tragedy, weakened by disease. He began spending more time at Sagamore Hill, walking the grounds, sitting in his library surrounded by his books, reflecting on his life and his losses. He thought about his father, dead more than 40 years. He thought about his first wife, Alice, dead 34 years, the light of his life gone forever. He thought about Quentin, buried in France, dead at 20 years old, the son who had flown too high and fallen from the sky. In his darker moments, Roosevelt must have wondered if his philosophy of the strenuous life, his belief in courage and action over caution and safety, had cost him the people he loved most. Had he been right to encourage his sons to go to war? Would Quentin still be alive if his father had been a different kind of man, one who valued safety over honor? These are questions that have no answers, only the terrible weight of living with their consequences. The winter of 1918 came to the less that looked apart. We had never jumped with one of the 30 mill games, a winter of 1918-9. The winter of 1918 came to the lass that look when they had not standed with the first for biggin skills. The winter of 1918 birth, which were moving it him to both themselves have traded for their live. The winter of 1918-2 came to the forter. The winter of 1918 came to which livin with completely, which willing the severe with a disability to living with. We have a terrible that definitely live them. The winter of 1918-2 came to the loves of the living with completely complete to play one he's stelling. The winter of 1918-2 came to the forter would be. The winter of 1918-2 came to the lest of the forter. The winter of 1918 far that would we moved with eased and had learny performed where he has man. The winter of 1918-2 came to the death may have beth. The winter of 1918-3, and had never lived that would we moved with eased with a noom. The winter of 1918 Thor would we moved it bid. The winter of 1918-4 had curd for the work. The winter of 1918-3 came to the death which we moved with eased with a noom. The winter of 1918-2 came to the death which we moved with bid. The winter of 1918 Thor had curd for the work of the work. The winter of 1918 third had worked to the earliest work of a love. The winter of 1918 third had curd for the work of the work. The winter of 1918 6 had worked to the earliest work of the work of the work. The winter of 1918 third had curd for the work. The winter of 1918 third had worked to the work of the work. The winter of 1918-3 had curd for the work of the work, had worked to the work. The winter of 1918-3 had curd for the work. The winter of 1918-3 had curd for the work. The winter of 1918-3 had heard for the work. The winter of 1918-3 had curd for the work of the work. The winter of 1918-3 had worked to the work. The winter of 1918-3 had heard for the work. The winter of 1918-3 had curd for the work. The winter of 1918-3 had heard for the work. The winter of 1918-3 had curd for the work. The winter of 1918-3 had heard for the work. The winter of 1918-3 had heard for the work. The winter of 1918-3 had heard for the work. The winter of 1918-3 had heard for the work. The winter of 1918-3 had heard for the work. The winter of 1918-3 had heard for the work. The winter of 1918-3 had heard for the work. The winter of 1918-3 had heard for the work. The winter of 1918-3 had heard for the work. The winter of 1918-3 had heard for the work. The winter of 1918-3 had heard for the work. The winter of 1918-3 had heard for the work. The winter of 1918-3 had heard for the work. The winter of 1918-3 had heard for the work. The winter of 1918-3 had heard for the work. The winter of 1918-3 had heard for the work. The winter of 1918-3 had heard for the work. The winter of 1918-3 had heard for the work. The winter of 1918-3 had heard for the work. The winter of 1918-3 had heard for the work. The winter of 1918-3 had heard for the work. The winter of 1918-3 had heard for the work. The winter of 1918-3 had heard for the work. The winter of 1918-3 had heard for the work. The winter of 1918-3 had heard for the work. The winter of 1918-3 had heard for the work. The winter of 1918-3 had heard for the work. The winter of 1918-3 had heard for the work. The winter of 1918-3 had heard for the work. The winter of 1918-3 had heard for the work. The winter of 1918-3 had heard for the work. The winter of 1918-3 had heard for the work. The winter of 1918-3 had heard for the work. The winter of 1918-3 had heard for the work. The winter of 1918-3 had heard for the work. The winter of 1918-3 had heard for the work. The winter of 1918-3 had heard for the work. The winter of 1918-3 had heard for the work. The winter of 1918-3 had heard for the work. The winter of 1918-3 had heard for the work. The winter of 1918 had hurt for the work. The winter of 1918 had hurt for the work. The winter of 1918 had hurt for the work. The winter of 1918 had hurt for the work. The winter of 1918 had hurt for the work. The Roosevelt developed inflammatory Hill. Roosevelt developed inflammatory rheumatism, likely related to the infections he had contracted in Brazil. He was in constant pain, sometimes unable to leave his bed. The doctors came and went, prescribing treatments that provided little relief. He continued to work when he could, dictating articles and letters, planning projects he would never complete. 1918, Theodore Roosevelt was admitted to Roosevelt Hospital in Manhattan. He spent several days there before being allowed to return to Sagamore Hill on December 28th. He was weak, in pain, but glad to be home. He spent his final days reading in his library, talking with Edith, seeing family members who came to visit. He spoke of future plans, articles he wanted to write, causes he wanted to support. He was not yet ready to give up, even though his body was clearly failing. January 5, 1919, Roosevelt felt well enough to work. He dictated several letters to his secretary, discussing conservation issues and political matters. After dinner, he spent time with Edith, and they talked about Sagamore Hill and how much they both loved it. Later, she would remember him standing at the window of the gate room, looking out over the snow-covered grounds, and saying, "I wonder if you know how much I love Sagamore Hill." That night, tired but in relatively good spirits. Sometime in the early morning hours of January 6, 1919, a blood clot broke loose and traveled to his lungs. Theodore Roosevelt died in his sleep, never knowing that the end had come. He was 60 years old. Legacy. The man in the arena. Cortege wound through the streets of Oyster Bay on a cold January morning, past houses where people stood in silent respect, past the church where Roosevelt had worshipped, up the steep hill to Young's Memorial Cemetery. The great and powerful came to pay their respects. Presidents and senators, judges and military officers, writers and scientists, people from all walks of life who had been touched by his life and work. They buried him on the hillside overlooking the bay he had loved since childhood, the landscape that had been the backdrop for so much of his life. The grave was simple, marked by a modest stone without elaborate decoration or lengthy inscription. It seemed fitting for a man who, despite all his achievements and fame, had maintained a fundamental simplicity of character. Hezbollah mourned. Newspapers across the country ran editorials celebrating his life and achievements. Critics who had opposed him politically acknowledged his importance and his impact. Even those who had disagreed with him most sharply recognized that something essential had been lost, that Theodore Roosevelt had been a force of nature, a presence that had shaped American life for a generation. But what exactly had he accomplished? What legacy did he leave beyond the memories and stories? The question is more complex than it might first appear, because Roosevelt's impact operated on multiple levels, some of which are easier to measure than others. The most visible legacy is physical and institutional. The national parks and forests he protected still exist, providing recreation and preserving wilderness for millions of Americans every year. The Panama Canal still operates, though now under Panamanian rather than American control, facilitating global commerce. The progressive reforms he championed, the regulation of corporations, the protection of consumers, the conservation of resources, these became fundamental principles of American governance even when the specific policies evolved. He expanded the power and prestige of the presidency itself, transforming it from a largely administrative office into a position of genuine leadership and agenda-setting authority. Before Roosevelt, presidents generally deferred to Congress and operated within narrow constitutional limits. Roosevelt showed that a president could shape public opinion, drive national policy, and used the office as a platform for advancing causes. Every president since has operated in the shadow of that transformation. His trust-busting established the principle that the conservating presidents believe before in the common side. His importance so graphically in the serve is one of the present challenge of the problem. His resolent that no he would contact, and which was completely fitters that the power who would fill from their in control. His trust-busting is actually posted because one of the transformation that the presidents. His trust-busting established the principle that they could not transformation of an interest for the problem. In the most Chris-conciliar revited way, his trust-busting is actually posted. He's president since that the conservate is recognized policy and will install that most is important of self. He's established the principle that even the largest corporations were subject to law and government oversight. He did not destroy capitalism, but rather saved it from its own worst excesses by demonstrating that reform was possible without revolution. The regulatory state that emerged in the 20th century, for better and worse, grows from seeds Roosevelt planted. His conservation work created the framework for environmental protection that continues to this day. The idea that natural resources belong to all Americans and should be protected for future generations, that some places are too valuable to be exploited for immediate profit, that human beings have a responsibility to be stewards rather than merely exploiters of the earth. These concepts became embedded in American culture largely through Roosevelt's efforts. Legacy is also more personal and less tangible. He embodied a particular vision of what human life could be, a philosophy he called the strenuous life. This was not merely about physical vigor, though that was part of it, but about engagement with life in all its forms. It meant embracing challenge rather than avoiding it, taking risks rather than seeking safety, striving for achievement rather than accepting mediocrity. His most famous speech, delivered in Paris in 1910, Roosevelt articulated this philosophy in words that have echoed through the decades. It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat. The man in the arena captures the essence of Roosevelt's philosophy. Life was not a spectator sport. It demanded participation, courage, the willingness to risk failure in pursuit of worthy goals. The person who tried and failed was more honorable than the person who never tried at all. Roosevelt lived this philosophy completely. From his childhood from placed in words, in well his Roosevelt from his greatly biggest to meet, which was lift in the mote of trial and slow the revolute. The person who tried and failed was not an honorable than the person who never tried. Roosevelt lived this philosophy, his means by fully and first with generally and revolute, who stutter many of the involved that worch worst, which is only lived at the forms. Roosevelt lived this philosophy, who spake to be failed nobody. From his childhood battle against asthma, through his political career, to his adventures in Cuba and Brazil, he was always in the arena, always striving, always risking, always engaged. He made mistakes. He held views on race and imperialism that we now recognize as deeply flawed. His interventions in Latin America created resentments that poisoned relations for decades. His certainty in his own righteousness sometimes blinded him to valid criticism and alternative perspectives. Yet, even acknowledging these failures and flaws, the overall record remains remarkable. Theodore Roosevelt transformed himself from a sickly child into a symbol of physical vigor. He endured personal tragedies that would have destroyed many people, and emerged from them not hardened or embittered, but even more committed to living fully. He achieved the presidency, used that power to advance causes that made America more just and more sustainable. He explored unknown corners of the earth and contributed to scientific knowledge. He wrote dozens of books on subjects ranging from history to natural history to politics. Most importantly, he demonstrated that one person, through force of will and commitment to action, could make a genuine difference in the world. The challenges he faced were real and daunting: corporate monopolies that seemed unstoppable, wilderness that appeared inexhaustible and thus in no need of protection, a political system resistant to reform, physical ailments that should have limited what he could accomplish. Yet he tackled all of them with energy and determination. And while he did not solve every problem or win every battle, he moved the needle. He changed the trajectory. He made things better than they would have been without his efforts. His death in January 1919 marked the end of an era in more ways than one. The old 19th century world of his youth was gone, swept away by the catastrophe of World War I. The progressive era he had helped launch was giving way to a more conservative politics. The frontier that had shaped so much of his imagination and experience had officially closed decades earlier, replaced by an industrialized, urbanized America that would have been almost unrecognizable to his father's generation. But the principles he stood for, the values he embodied, the example he set, these continued to resonate. Americans who came of age reading about his exploits, who heard his speeches, who absorbed his philosophy of the strenuous life, carried those influences into the 20th century. They became the leaders, the reformers, the adventurers of the next generation, and many of them explicitly cited Roosevelt as their inspiration. Today, more than Roosevelt remains one of the most admired presidents in American history. Historians consistently rank him near the top in assessments of presidential greatness. Mount Rushmore, that monument to the nation's most significant leaders, includes his face carved into the granite alongside Washington, Jefferson, and Lincoln. His image appears on currency. His name graces schools and parks and streets across the country. But perhaps the most fitting memorial is not any statue or park or building. It is the simple fact that he lived fully, that he squeezed from his 60 years more experience and achievement than most people would accomplish in several lifetimes, that he faced challenges and tragedies that would have defeated many, but kept fighting until the very end. The boy who struggled to breathe became the man who could not be stopped. The young widower whose light went out on February 14, 1884, kept living with intensity and purpose despite his grief. The politician who lost the presidency in 1912 immediately looked for new challenges rather than accepting defeat as final. Theodore Roosevelt was always in the arena, and he remained there until the moment death finally took him, sleeping, because, as Vice President Marshall so perfectly observed, if he had been awake, there would have been a fight. His last words to Edith, expressing his love for Sagamore Hill, capture something essential about him. He loved the land, the place, the physical world he had fought so hard to protect. But more than that, he loved being alive, loved the experience of living in all its pain and joy and challenge and triumph. He spent himself completely in the service of causes he believed in, used every ounce of energy he possessed, pushed himself to and sometimes past the limits of human endurance. And when it was finally over, when his magnificent body could no longer sustain the demands he placed upon it, when the cumulative toll of asthma and bullets and malaria and infection and arthritis and blood clots finally exceeded even his formidable resilience, he could look back on a life that had been lived to its absolute fullest. He had been in the arena. He had dared greatly. He had known triumph and defeat, victory and tragedy, joy and sorrow, all of it fully experienced and deeply felt. His life on February 14th, 1884, had not stayed extinguished. Theodore Roosevelt had rekindled it through will and action and commitment to living. And when the final darkness came on January 6, 1919, he had no reason for regret. He had made his body. He had overcome his weaknesses. He had fought his battles. He had left the world better than he found it. Death took him sleeping, but Theodore Roosevelt had lived wide awake.